Narcissistic relationships are death by 1,000 cuts. It's often not the big betrayals that bring people down in these relationships, though obviously it can be, but it's often these accumulated micro-injuries, being dismissed almost whenever you share about yourself, being treated with contempt when you share emotion. Have any of you ever been in a narcissistic relationship where they blamed you for the inconvenience that was caused by your illness? Listen on, because we're going to take that on today. This is a tough one because if you're thinking like, say what? Yeah, they'll blame you for the inconvenience you caused by getting sick. Thank you to the person who wrote in with this question because it really echoed something I've witnessed in multiple cases of narcissistic abuse, especially in longer term relationships. So I think it's an important one to take on, or it's a cautionary tale. So imagine the narcissistic person was inconvenienced by your cancer or some other long-term illness or your pregnancy or your back surgery. And they have no problem telling you. The communication geniuses that they are, right? So they may say something to you like, hey, I just want you to know all that chemotherapy stuff you did and you losing your hair and having to drive you and sit in the hospital, having to deal with you. It was really inconvenient for me and darn insurance paperwork. Or they may something like, just so you are aware, it was really hard for me after your surgery. It totally threw off my schedule. And they say this with a straight face. How dare you inconvenience them with your hospitalization and your illness? I have actually seen it happen to people in my life in real time. And I remember feeling sick when I saw it happen. Not because I was surprised. The narcissists are going to invalidate. It's what they do. But because I knew how much it hurt the person who was sick and actually still held hope and believed that maybe their illness would be the wake-up call for the toxic person in their life. So you might be thinking, what the hell is this about? This almost feels sadistic. Well, just as a reminder, the only reality and experience in the world for them is theirs. So when something as real as your illness comes up, it is really experienced as an affront. How dare there be an experience that's not mine, and on top of that, one that's actually inconveniencing me. So when you are sick and other people are checking in to send you well wishes or maybe help or send some food or be supportive or just be kind, none of those calls are for the narcissistic person, are they? And even when those people call to talk with the narcissistic person, they may say things like, oh my goodness, your wife is so brave. Well, that's not going to work for the narcissistic person who views themselves almost delusionally as the only one who can be brave and good. Your illness may also be a grim reminder of their own mortality, or it may actually throw off their schedule. That's what happens. When you love or care, supposed to love or care someone who's sick, it does throw off your schedule. Plans may need to be canceled or rescheduled. Things may not happen as you thought. Your energy may wane, and because you are preoccupied, you may not be as good a source of supply. Basically, the rhythms of life change, and it's not because of them. And it may even be worse, that while you are ill, they may even accuse you of making it too big a deal. So they'll say, oh, please, it's just stage 3 cancer. At least it's not stage 4. Yeah. Or they'll say something like, oh, people have babies all the time. Or, is it really that bad? Do we really need to drive all the way to the emergency room right now? I'm finishing the game here. While you are in the midst of the illness, many times, obviously, you're so absorbed with it, especially if it is more acute, that you almost can't entertain the thought that they do not care. It's painful to think that someone may not care when you're in the most vulnerable spot of your life. And on top of that, you are just needing to survive. So maybe you actually do need their ride to the hospital or for them to help you up the stairs or whatever it may be. At those times, there may be cognitive dissonance for you, justification, and as I said, preoccupation with your own situation. So you just can't go there to a radical acceptance space of, wow, I actually think they're aggravated because I am sick. If all goes well, you come out of the medical crisis. In some cases, perhaps you'll be changed for your lifetime. Maybe you'll have issues with mobility or need ongoing therapies, or there's risks of relapse, but you do get better. You aren't so fragile. And that's usually when the narcissistic person will tell you something this insensitive. And no, you don't get to give them points for waiting until you weren't dying to give you this feedback and tell you that your illness inconvenienced them. What it means is that you actually did read the situation correctly in the first place. They really were annoyed when you were sick, as upsetting as that might seem. And now, in the aftermath of your illness, to hear them share with you that they were actually inconvenienced can also be unsettling. It's also possible that they will minimize it and say things like, well, it couldn't have been that bad, you're better, aren't you? And yet, having to have experienced a life-changing illness and have it be glossed over. Again, so invalidating, so unempathic. For those of you who have endured an accident that required care afterwards, a difficult pregnancy, or frankly, any pregnancy or an illness, and to be viewed as an inconvenience, at a minimum, let this terrible experience be a wake-up call. So you've already been through this whole illness or this mess, right? But it's a grim reminder that if you do become ill again, your health struggles again, or you have a recurrence, that it will be, again, that you're going to hear that you're inconvenient again. So that means now while you're well, make sure you get your plan Bs in place and stop waiting for the wondrous moment that the narcissist is going to roll up and help you. Illness is the ultimate test of a narcissistic relationship, and invariably they fail. Many people are devastated when they recognize that all the justifying and wishing it was different and the wishful thinking, it all becomes devastating when you become sick. And the willingness to just say that they were actually able to say out loud that they were inconvenienced by your illness speaks to the fact that relationships for narcissistic folks are really merely transactional and functional. The test of a relationship is not the love bombing or the charm or the charisma. It's really the test of any relationship, is whether they're willing to hold your hand when you're sick. And they view it as a privilege to be able to sit there and get you through it. That's a healthy relationship. Always remember that that's the measure of love. And even if your illness may have at times been called an inconvenience, as difficult things in life are, when you're sick or at any time, you're the last person in the world who should ever have had to hear that. And all of us deserve better. In your narcissistic relationship, what happened when you might have been in a group and you were sharing some of your goals, some of your aspirations, some of your dreams, or even something good that happened to you? What did the narcissistic person do? For how many of you were you told that you were just merely sharing a piece of information? Oh, I got a small promotion a couple weeks ago. And you were told that you were showing off? Let's break that down because it happens more often than you think. I mean, it's not a good feeling when all you're doing is sharing something very basic. Oh, something good happens to you, whatever it is. Like I said, maybe you get a small promotion at work, or you got some meaningful praise for something good that you did. Whatever it is, it may be big, it may be small, and you share it with other people because it feels good, because you're happy, because something good happened, right? Or maybe you do something like you share an aspiration. Perhaps you hold on to an aspiration that you want to go to graduate school or law school, or you hope to launch your own business someday, or engage in some kind of a creative endeavor that you've always dreamt of, like writing a book or something like that. You may also have an experience of seeing something. Maybe, for example, I don't know, there's a TV show that features a city that you've traveled to or a restaurant that you ate at. And you make a comment, a passing comment. You say, oh my gosh, that's so neat. I've seen that when I went there. Just sweet, like the observations we make about our lives when we feel connected to things. Or maybe someone is sharing a story in a group you're in, and you listen to it, and then you can relate to it through personal experience. You let them tell their whole story, and you might say, oh yeah, I know that place. I've been there. You just sort of connect to them. So you understand kind of what I'm talking about is, whatever it is I'm talking about, it's a sort of a circumstance where it is not crazy bragging, and I'm not talking about a circumstance where you're talking over someone or hijacking a conversation. In this situation, I'm really talking about circumstances in which you're just sharing a piece of good news, or you might be sharing a goal that you have down the road, or you might be sharing a piece of information of something that happened in your life that's related to what someone else is sharing, right? Get the backdrop here? So then the narcissistic person in your midst will shut it down and say, oh my gosh, you're showing off, a little bit of eye rolling, right? I am certain that many of you have experienced this, that you simply want to share something good or interesting or compelling from your life, and you do it appropriately, and it gets shut down. This may be something that has been happening to you since you were young, and you had a narcissistic parent or parents, and perhaps you shared some good news, and were told by your parents or someone else in the family, oh golly, now just stop showing off. Or you were in a narcissistic relationship as an adult, and you may share something, any of these things I'm talking about, and be told that you're an attention seeker, or oh my gosh, you need so much validation. Now, this kind of wing clipping can happen repeatedly to the point that many people in narcissistic relationships kind of get ahead of it and slowly start cutting their own wings and stop sharing about themselves. I have been struck in my own clinical work with clients how often clients experiencing narcissistic abuse had some really cool stuff happen in their lives, and they don't even really bring it up in the session. And when they finally do, it's like an afterthought, or they're bashful, or it's as though they're embarrassed. And when I'm kind of jumping up and down, I'm so excited for them, they play it down and say, ugh, it's not that big a deal. I know that dance, and I recognize it's happening. And it's very likely that at other times in their lives, when they have shared their good news or hopes or aspirations, that they have been shut down. Narcissistic relationships are death by 1,000 cuts. It's often not the big betrayals that bring people down in these relationships, though obviously it can be, but it's often these accumulated micro-injuries. Being dismissed almost whenever you share about yourself, being treated with contempt when you share emotion. Little by little, you are indoctrinated and shaped into cutting more and more of yourself off. People who have been in severely narcissistically abusive relationships for long periods of time, they look silenced over time, sometimes almost hunched over, rarely sharing about themselves. And when they do, or it's discovered by other people that they've done something really great or interesting, the people in these narcissistic relationships sort of shut it down, say, oh, it wasn't that big a deal. Narcissistic people may actually be arrogant enough to say things like, pride goeth before a fall, apparently for everyone but them. Now, you're all watching this channel smart enough to know that a lot of what is at play here is jealousy and insecurity. The narcissistic person can't stand the idea of anyone else succeeding or getting attention from others or stealing this spotlight, not that that was what you're trying to do. And on top of that, your success very likely is triggering their insecurities as well. But the why that it happens, we know why it happens with them. It's not as important as the long-term impacts on you. Because when this happens enough, you lose your voice, you lose your sense of self-advocacy, and you lose that healthy sense of pride. I have watched people just stop sharing about themselves. And these were people who were a hell of a lot more interesting than the narcissistic people who had been around them and were clipping their wings. When I found out later some of the amazing things that these people had done, and ask, why didn't you share this? This is amazing. They'd usually shrug it off and say, ugh, whatever, it's not that big a deal. These relationships shape identity because believing that something that you aspire to or have accomplished, or just as a shared experience you have with others, you're told it's not important. You're told that you're not important. And over time, that leads to self-devaluation and can even lead you to holding yourself back. It's so crucial to understand that these patterns are a thing and that they emanate, again, largely from the narcissistic folks' insecurity, as well as their need to leave other people feeling as bad and empty as them, though that part isn't conscious. But these experiences shape us, especially if they happen to you as a child. When you were repeatedly told you were to be seen and not heard, that to be prideful was wrong, but in the same breath, you would see that narcissistic parent self-aggrandize and always make it about themselves. This pattern also leaves many survivors wondering if they are showing off. Like, am I sort of being an arrogant, braggy person? Or even wondering, am I the narcissist? And because of that, it can magnify the self-blame, the confusion, the self-doubt, and the many other things that happen to people in narcissistic relationships, all of which ultimately leave us constantly questioning ourselves. There are many ways that narcissistic relationships slowly steal yourself from yourself. And this is one of them. This idea that you ever speaking about things that are relevant to you, that's somehow braggy, attention-seeking, or prideful. You, after being in a narcissistic relationship, clearly know the difference between sharing and showing off. It's hard, but the hard work is not letting them get into your head and understanding that this is one of the many abusive tricks that shows up in these relationships. It's important you share the wonderful things that happen to you and the things you share with others. This is how we create social connections. This is how you learn to advocate for yourself. And this is how you get to hear the validation from the healthy people in your midst, rather than the constantly being shutting down. But when it happens enough, it gets really, really hard. It's almost like touching a hot stove. You do it enough, you're never going to do it again. And over time, you learn that sharing the good things about your life is always going to get you shut down. Consider it a conscious effort to keep doing that, to try to share those things with safe people, and slowly lean into yourself and recognize that not only do you have a right to share these things, it's important that you do, because healthy people want to hear it. Now, there's a wonderful word in German that captures something so specific and pathologic. We all do it, right? The glee and joy that someone experiences at someone else's misfortune. That word is Schadenfreude. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. And it is a signature move of the narcissistic person. However, I know some of you might think that's what this was about, but it's not. That's not what this video is about. This video is about the red flag of the green monster called jealousy. A jealousy that shows up early and often in a narcissistic relationship. I guess the green-eyed monster, right? So here are some of the red flaggy jealous comments I have heard people say that I've written out over the years. Oh, God, anyone with a computer can write a book. I've been planning on it too, but I have so much other important stuff happening in my life. Or, of course he got that job. His father has all the connections. He's an idiot, so I'm sure they will humor him, and the rich will just get richer, and people like me will have to keep working harder than anyone else. Or, she better be glad she's getting married too young to a person with money, because look at her skin. She is going to age horribly, and I am sure he's going to trade her in for a younger model before long. Or, it's so sad that they're so insecure that they need that big house. I wonder what they're trying to compensate for. It's those digs that come up early and often. But remember, jealousy, the green-eyed monster of jealousy, is a universal emotion. We all feel it. Me, you, everyone. I think of jealousy as the canary in the psychological coal mine. The things that make us jealous are the things that ping our insecurity, whether that is our appearance, or our bank account, or our education, or our family of origin. The list is endless, and everybody has something. So what makes jealousy that shows up early a red flag? And why is it so relevant to narcissism? Again, as I said, all of us experience jealousy from time to time. It's a universal human emotion. For narcissistic people who are far more insecure than the rest of us, the experience of jealousy is far more deep and destructive and dark. And it comes up early because everyone they encounter is experienced as sort of a threat. And so at some level, unless someone's really down and out, everyone brings up a little bit of jealousy for most narcissistic people. It's the myriad passing comments, just like the ones I gave you as examples earlier in this video, that come up so early and often. But a particular red flag above all jealousies comes out, and that's around the success of other people. And these successes can be anything: a professional accomplishment, a promotion, finishing school, starting school, getting married, having a child, buying a house, going on a trip, whatever, take your pick. It's the success of other people that activates the insecurity, the shame, and the inadequacy of the narcissistic person. Many times you may even be taken aback by the jealous reaction they have about someone else's success. It may be about someone they do not even know. For example, a story you are relating about someone, and for whatever reason, their inadequacy is being activated, and boom, the jealousy will pop. In an intimate relationship, their jealousy about someone's successes may be expressed in early dating relationships. In a familial relationship, you may not have understood how to process a parent's jealousy about other people as a child, but now you see it popping up all the time in them when you're an adult. And when you try to soften what they're saying, let them know that, hey, that person who succeeded, they really earned it. They worked hard for it. Whatever reasoning you try to give, you then find yourself in the unappealing situation of experiencing their narcissistic wrath. Your attempt to temper their reaction may actually activate their shame, and then boom, you get some of the wrath as well. Now, obviously, jealousy about other people's successes is a red flag that definitely shows up in workplaces. You may be working in a place where someone is always diminishing other people's accomplishments or otherwise invalidating other people's successes or hard works or whatever. Even when that other person's accomplishments, somebody works in an entirely different division or something, doesn't minimize the successes of the narcissistic person. And God forbid if it is something competitive and that there's something that the narcissistic person was hoping to achieve at, then the jealousy will feel downright poisonous. And now listen, again, we all have our moments when someone has something we want. We might even cast a little shade. But the consistency, pervasiveness, and them showing their jealousy early on without even knowing you. So sharing their jealousy about someone else's successes without even knowing you, pay attention to that. The heavy jealousy about someone else's success that shows itself early on is a potent red flag that many people kick themselves for not paying attention to earlier. So think about it. Drop it in the comments too. Have you ever had that experience? You think about the narcissist you know or have known, that early in the game, they really, really were jealous of someone else having a good experience. And then what did that turn to over the course of your relationship with that person, whether it was a friendship or a intimate partnership, whatever? Drop that in the comments, because I'm guessing that this red flag is a lot more common than any of us think. Something that many of you who have been in relationships with any kind of narcissist, whether it's a partner or a family member, someone you work with, is when they tell you you're being too dramatic. Well, let's break that down, because that's such a classical dynamic in these relationships, and yet it really frustrates people. So what does it mean? What does it mean when a narcissistic person tells you that you're being too sensitive or too dramatic? So let's go back to that that's actually a very interesting question, right? Because it happens all the time. What does it actually mean? How do you decode this when somebody, particularly somebody who is narcissistic, is telling you that you are being overly dramatic, you're being overly sensitive? Okay, I think some of you already know the answer, right? You've watched enough of these videos, you've read enough about this, you know the answer, and I wish I could give you multiple choice. Yes, you know, it's gaslighting, right? It's a form of gaslighting. It's a form of manipulation. It sheds doubt on your state of mind and your emotional processing. When someone calls you too sensitive, okay, you react to something like, oh, you're too sensitive, they are actually doubting or questioning the validity of your emotional reaction in a given situation. So can anyone really do that? You have the reaction you have. There is also an element of shaming, right? They should have shamed your emotions, because many survivors of narcissistic abuse already live with a tremendous amount of shame, blaming themselves for what has happened in the relationship, and often feeling very ashamed for not being able to figure it out. Like, why didn't I see this sooner? I'm an idiot. And they really, really will go at themselves. A narcissist telling you that you are doing it wrong, that basically that you're doing emotion wrong, that you're not feeling things the right way, can actually feel shaming, that you can't even do your emotions right. And that sense of shame results in even more isolation. By saying that you're being too dramatic, that you're being too emotional, it may not only result in a sense of shame, you are also being told, again, that your emotions lack validity, right? And that pulls you away from your reality. And what it also becomes is a chance for a narcissistic or antagonistic person to control the emotional temperature of the situation. And remember, and I've said this repeatedly, narcissistic people control the thermostat, both literally, they actually get to run the thermostat in the house, but also emotionally. They're having a happy day, then you have to be happy, or they'll criticize you for raining on their parade. Now, many times people view gaslighting as something quite different, right? They don't think of gaslighting as somebody saying you're too sensitive, but they might view gaslighting, for example, as the narcissistic person controlling your physical space. For example, they'll move a TV remote or move your keys and then deny they moved them. They'll take a check out of the checkbook and said that they didn't take the check, and that will mess you up when you're trying to balance the checkbook. Or they'll deny things that you know happened. For example, they'll say something like, oh, we never went to that restaurant. Well, some of you may be wondering, well, aren't there reactions, in fact, truly reactions that actually are too dramatic or just too much? I mean, I think it's extremely subjective. For example, let's say someone shows up 20 minutes late to a birthday gathering or a casual dinner where people you knew were going to sort of keep streaming in. And then because they showed up 20 minutes late, you start screaming and crying and pulling your hair. I'll give you that. That's probably a disproportionate reaction. Or if someone says to you that they won't be able to help you with the laundry, and you start sobbing and wailing and say that you feel like you might die because they don't help you with the laundry, I'll give you disproportionate on that. That's not the sort of distinction I'm trying to draw here. This is about when a person shows appropriate emotion, real emotion, in an appropriate manner, following some kind as part of an interchange. For example, you say that you might feel hurt about a disappointment that's happened between the two of you, or you just feel hurt about something that happened to you. But perhaps if your reaction, and you express it clearly, it's hurt or anger or some other strong show of emotion in the face of your real hurt, and you express that, and if your expression of it is not something that works for the narcissist, especially if it is something they wouldn't like. But you're not screaming, you're not yelling, you're not engaging in violence, you're not physically, sort of throwing objects. And under those conditions, someone tells you that you're being overly dramatic for sharing your feelings. That's really going to mess with your head. It's really going to leave you doubting yourself. Too often, In relationships that are characterized by narcissism or other high conflict styles, telling someone who is appropriately sharing their feelings or emotions that they are being too emotional, let's face it, it's a way of the narcissistic person in the relationship deflecting their own responsibility in the situation. If you are expressing disappointment about something that arises in a relationship with a narcissistic person, instead of the narcissistic person directly addressing their behavior or their words, what they're saying, or their own conduct, by calling, instead what they do is they'll call you out as too sensitive or too emotional or too dramatic. What it does is it shifts and it deflects the responsibility for emotion in the relationship and or for anything in the relationship off of them onto you. The focus shifts to you and your alleged dysregulation instead of on their behavior. And then you actually find yourself defending yourself, and instead of addressing the issue at hand, which was sometimes their behavior. So much of this comes down to basically what I could call the narcissistic person's allergy to empathy. Meeting someone halfway and taking their reaction in and being present with somebody else is empathic. Instead of labeling it, and then if you label it as overly dramatic, that's not empathic. So many people in any kind of narcissistic relationship have run into this pattern, even when they're growing up as a child. For example, narcissistic parents are notorious for negating their children's disappointment by saying really unkind things like, oh, stop making such a big deal of it, or stop being so dramatic. The parent will be saying this to a child. At those times, the child looks to the parent for what we call co-regulation, to get the mirroring that something, that's basically the way the parent reacts, would show the child, yep, something is difficult is happening, and the child is safe to emotionally share it and safely let it out. That legacy of being told that you are being too dramatic or too sensitive can permeate into childhood and leave a person permanently doubting their own reactions or censoring all of their own emotions. Narcissistic people do not like having to be held accountable for their behaviors or their words. Taking responsibility and accountability are very, very difficult for narcissistic people. And instead, they'll often deflect by diminishing the person who is giving the feedback. Telling a person they are being too dramatic or too sensitive is often a quick way for a difficult person to take the focus off of their behavior and maintain control in a given situation. Next time you are called overly dramatic, I want you to take a step back, assess your own reaction through a realistic lens, and if your reaction was really what you think was within normal limits and was an acknowledgement, honestly, of your experience, instead of pathologizing yourself, think about how it serves the other person to label you as such. It is so classical for people in these relationships to be viewed as overly dramatic. And in fact, many times for a narcissistic person in these relationships saying, oh, I don't like drama. And because to you that idea of drama is now being portrayed as something undesirable, people in these relationships will find themselves losing their full range of emotion and almost narrowing it to a point where there's absolutely sort of nothing to them anymore, that they're almost behaving in sort of a robotic lockstep in a way that basically suits the narcissistic person in their lives. It would be a crime and a shame to lose that beautiful range of emotion that makes each of us individual. Hope that makes sense and clarifies some of why narcissistic people so consistently call other people overly sensitive or overly dramatic. It's a tool of control, and it's definitely an indication of gaslighting. So you're in a relationship with a narcissistic person, and they go to therapy. What happens next? I'd love for you to also drop in the comments. Has that happened? You've been in a relationship with a narcissistic person and they go to therapy. Here's all I have to say about this. Be careful what you ask for. We know that in general, when narcissistic folks go to therapy, the research shows they're more likely to drop out prematurely or at the moment when a therapist wants them to go deep emotionally or be accountable or take responsibility. That's when they try to cut bait. But the fact is, more than a few narcissistic folks go to therapy, especially people who are vulnerable or what are sometimes called covert narcissists, because they're also more likely to have issues like anxiety, depression, the stuff that typically gets folks into therapy. So you're in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic, they go to therapy. I'm sure you were thinking, isn't it good that they're going into therapy? Maybe there is hope. Maybe they will start unpacking their stuff and working on empathy and compassion, and it'll just be better. It's a long shot, especially if the person has moderate to severe narcissistic patterns, but unicorns sometimes happen. But it is a long shot that you're going to see any change that's meaningful to you in a relationship. But there's a bigger issue here. A bigger problem is that if you're in a relationship with somebody narcissistic and they go to therapy, they may quite often play a different kind of game. So let me sort of lay this out as a scenario, as a means of showing it to you. You are in a relationship with a narcissistic person. After much hemming and hawing, they actually end up going to therapy. They go to therapy. They go for a few sessions, more than a few sessions, maybe even a few months. And then they report back and tell you that their therapist said that they're not the problem, but in fact that it's you that's the problem. That they told the therapist about the things that you're doing in the relationship. I don't know, for example, maybe you tried to set a boundary. And then the narcissistic person will come home from therapy and they'll say, you know what? My therapist said that you're being controlling. They may also say that my therapist said that you have to recognize that when I raise my voice, it's my trauma talking, and that at those times you need to be present with me and hug me and love me like my parent didn't. Now, to say that when they come home and say that stuff to you is a mind F is an understatement. Now, if you're not a therapist, which most people aren't, you may even think that the narcissistic person is coming home from therapy and telling the truth. That maybe their therapist does think that you're controlling, or that you are supposed to be their mommy and love them better. And many survivors are already doing that to themselves. But to hear that their therapist may be suggesting that, that can make things even worse. I can tell you this, in most cases, a therapist is not telling their client that someone setting boundaries is controlling, or that the other person in the relationship should have to endure verbal abuse. Now, sadly, I say most cases, because some therapists may not get it right, but in most cases they do. However, therapy is also garbage in, garbage out. If the client is telling us things that are not true, or are exaggerations or are distortions, our position is to believe the client. So if the client is telling the therapist untruths about things that the other person in the relationship is doing, it's quite conceivable that the therapist may not view the other person in the best light. The challenge here is that if the narcissistic person does this, they tell you that their therapist is saying all this stuff and it works. For example, maybe you start becoming looser with your boundaries, or you actually do give them a big hug when they yell at you. I can promise you this, they're going to keep doing it and telling you more therapist nonsense. For any of us in a narcissistic relationship, the key issue is that we recognize that abuse is abuse, and that it isn't your responsibility to hug someone when they yell at you or excuse their bad behavior on the basis of their sad backstory. It is an adult's responsibility to get their own house in order and find ways of responding that are not frightening or abusive. So no matter what tidbits your narcissistic partner may come home from therapy with, the key is to recognize that it's not the therapist's role to necessarily weigh in on the behavior you need to change. so you can maintain your boundaries as you usually do. So all of that said, because most survivors of narcissistic abuse, whether it's past abuse or abuse that's happening right now in real time, most survivors tend to blame themselves for what's happening in the relationship. They question themselves, they internalize the gaslighting, and they live in self-doubt. And many survivors are also quite grateful when the narcissistic person in their lives goes to therapy, and they want to support it. So when the narcissistic person comes home from therapy with feedback, suggestions, or direction, it can play upon your existing self-blame and confusion. And people in these relationships may find themselves doubting themselves even more, or even wondering if they are actually the problem, since the narcissistic person's therapist, according to the narcissistic person, is saying that they are. You're never going to find out the truth of what their therapist said, because therapy is confidential and their therapist isn't going to talk to you. So basically, the narcissistic person can come home and say whatever they want about what their therapist is saying. Here's the deal. If you aren't seeing substantive shifts in the narcissistic person's behavior, more empathy, more accountability, more self-awareness, more compassion, then whatever is happening in that therapy room is happening, but it sure as hell isn't resulting in meaningful change on your side. When I say that, your side, it isn't resulting in meaningful change on what you're seeing. Now, most people aren't therapists, and they believe that when a person comes home from therapy and says that the therapist is giving suggestions, they may not understand that a therapist is not going to make absurd suggestions to someone who is not their client. So I'm here to tell you that does not happen. So if somebody comes home and says, my therapist says you have to be nicer to me, it's probably not what they're saying. Be very wary when a narcissistic person rolls up to you and says, my therapist says you are this, or my therapist says you need to do that. In almost all cases, it's likely a distortion of something the therapist said, and it could be an attempt to weaponize their own therapy, capitalize on your empathy, and manipulate a situation further to their advantage. Listen, the proof is in the behavioral pudding. If you aren't seeing behavioral change, but are instead being told that you're a bad person, I can tell you one thing about their therapy: it ain't working. Somebody actually sent this suggestion in, so I'd like to thank that person. And they cleverly called this whole process, they called it narcissistic telephone, which I thought was actually quite an interesting way to put it. I really welcome the many ideas that people send in. I really enjoy doing the research on them and doing the deeper dives to further explain this. But like I said, next time the narcissistic person who's in therapy, it may not even be a partner, it may be a family member, they roll up to you and says, hey, my therapist said you're a bad person, I'm guessing that's not what they said. And so just take that with a grain of salt, and definitely don't receive it as an indictment on you. Thanks again.